Again, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, September the 20th, 2022, is meeting to continue its study on safe sport in Canada. Before I go forward, there are little bits of housekeeping. At the bottom, for those of you on virtual, at the bottom of the screen is a globe icon. Please look at it, and it can give you the translation you may need, so you can check in whether you want English, French, or floor original. If everything that you say or do should go through the chair, answering of questions, speaking, do not speak unless I have acknowledged that you can. And that is basically it. So I think we should begin, and I want to ask one question of the clerk. We have now only got 3/4 of an hour to do this. Is there any ability for us to go over that time, Mike, or do we just have to hard stop at 5:30?
No, we should be able to add a few minutes to the meeting for sure.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. Okay, so we're going to begin with Dr. Julie Macfarlane, co-founder of Can't Buy My Silence, Professor Emeritus of Law, the University of Windsor. We then have the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, Jill Schiller-Beer, Leading Change, Call to Action Coordinator, and Anthony Parker, Leading Change Facilitator. Now, just a little bit again to know that each of you, as a group, Ms. Schiller-Beer and Ms. Parker, you will have 5 minutes for the group. So you can divide up your time the way you see fit. Dr. Macfarlane, you have 5 minutes. And so we will begin now with Dr. Macfarlane for 5 minutes, please. I will give you a 30-second shout out when you should wrap up.
Thank you very much. My name is Julie Macfarlane, and I have been a law professor for 40 years, working in the UK, Ireland, Hong Kong, Australia, the US, and most of all, obviously, in Canada. I was honored with the Order of Canada for my work on access to justice in 2022. I'm also personally a survivor of sexual abuse and rape. In 2014, I sued the Anglican Church for sexual abuse by a church minister while I was a teenager. This was when I first encountered the default use of non-disclosure agreements to silence those who make settlements over sexual abuse. I told the Anglican Church immediately that I had no intention and would not consider signing an NDA. In fact, part of my settlement with them was a new code of practice for their insurers working with the victims of sexual violence and abuse, and it includes a provision that an NDA will only be used in, quote, exceptional circumstances. How naive I was then. Now I know this practice continues, and hence my commitment to legislative and not purely voluntary change that can be monitored. And I think that has other ramifications for the issues you're discussing here in the committee. In 2013, I became aware that one of my faculty colleagues at the University of Windsor was sexually harassing students. Having heard directly from the students he was targeting, I went to my president, who ordered his suspension and an investigation. And a year later, he was terminated for multiple instances of abuse and harassment in a 3-page termination letter. The students and I felt relieved. That is, until I began to receive calls from colleagues at overseas law schools where he had applied for a position. They were asking me, why did a 10-year professor leave the University of Windsor? I realized immediately the university had given him an NDA, a copy of which I now have, and it includes cleaning his personnel files for the previous 10 years and actually also a letter of recommendation, which he took with him. I'm sure this all sounds rather familiar, having just been listening to the testimony of Mr. Reid of Soccer Canada. It is absolutely plain that Bob Barado was given an NDA, as this is a default practice in the settlement of sexual abuse and harassment suits. And of course, that was why nothing was ever said about where he was going to work next. No red flag was placed by his name, and why Mr. Reid would have needed to get legal advice if he was going to speak about what he had done and to place a warning on him. We see this constantly, all the time. After 2 years of efforts to persuade the University of Windsor to change its policy on giving NDAs to people they acknowledged were known predators, I resigned in disgust in December 2020. I then joined forces with Zelda Perkins, who is the first woman to break her Harvey Weinstein NDA. And we have created Can't Buy My Silence, a global campaign to ban the use of NDAs which cover up misconduct. We have already made rapid strides, I'm happy to say, in Canada. We have a bill that has passed into law in Ontario, strengthening post-secondary institutions, that now bans universities like the University of Windsor from doing what they did in 2014, which feels very important to me personally. But further than that, having worked with lawmakers in Ireland to create a model bill to limit the use of NDAs to their original purpose, which, let's remember, was the protection of trade secrets. That legislation is going forward in Ireland now, and it has already been passed into law in Prince Edward Island as the Non-Disclosure Agreements Act 2022. And that legislation covers all workplaces, including universities, including voluntary positions, for example, coaching in a sports area. And that has now been tabled also in British Columbia, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, and very shortly now in Ontario. We have collected data at Can't Buy My Silence, which is both qualitative through personal anonymized stories of people who have been coerced into NDAs, who consistently don't understand what they're signing and consistently aren't given an alternative to protect their own confidentiality. The reality is that all these abuses, the ones that we've been hearing about this afternoon, and many others, are covered up in NDAs. And let's be clear, NDAs are not for the benefit of victims, although that is a prevalent myth. They are to protect the abuser and the organization. What is available for the victim is a one-sided confidentiality clause. Instead, they have to promise to protect the party who abused them, the person or the organization or both, in exchange for their own privacy. There is literally no good reason to have non-disclosure agreements, and in sports abuses, as in all other cases of abuse, misconduct, or discrimination. This is obviously what happened with Bob Barado of Soccer Canada, and it is consistently the story that we hear in the work that we now do on the campaign.
Please wrap up, Dr. Macfarlane.
Please recognize that the Hockey Canada case has demonstrated this to Canadians, and NDAs are the reason we never knew about these cases before, and they are the reason that Canada Soccer has been able to hide the misconduct of a coach who has then gone on to create further victims. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we go to the Leading Change Call to Action group. 5 minutes, please, for whomever is going to speak. Obviously, it's Ms. Schillebeer, yes?
Thank you.
5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to be joining you today from Amiskwaciwâskahikan, also known as Edmonton, and I use she, her pronouns. My colleague Anthony Parker, who uses he, him pronouns, lives in Mohkinstsis, which is also known as Calgary. We recognize that we are all treaty people and have a responsibility to understand our history so we can honor the past, be aware of the present, and create a just and caring future. So my team at the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, or ACWS, works to bring shelter-informed gender-based violence prevention education to diverse individuals, schools, community groups, workplaces, and sports teams. My colleague played as a wide receiver with the Calgary Stampeders, and through our 10-year partnership with that team, has become a leading change facilitator as well. Through our work, we have both seen firsthand the transformational effect that our program can have. ACWS and our members have been working in gender-based violence prevention since our organization was formed 40 years ago this month. We began strategic work to engage men and boys in the early 2000s through various programs we now call Leading Change. Leading Change has its roots in sports culture and was developed in partnership with Dr. Jackson Katz, who leads a highly regarded gender-based violence prevention program in the United States. As you can see from the Inspired Communities model that was submitted for everyone's review, our approach is rooted in 6 key values, and I'd like to highlight 3 of those. We are informed by women's organizations and experience. This is crucial, as though anyone can experience gender-based violence, women and gender minorities experience violence at the highest rates. Our program is both informed by and accountable back to those lived experiences. Secondly, we take a strengths-based approach. And what this means is that we focus on the things that we can do as opposed to the things that we can't. It also means that while we know most violence is perpetrated by men, most men are not violent. In fact, most men have more capacity to affect change than they may realize, and they are a vital part of the solution, as you have been discovering in your study. Thirdly, we know that transformation requires long-term, large-scale, and coordinated efforts. And we're grateful for the work of this committee to look at the issues facing Hockey Canada, not as limited to a few circumstances, but as widespread and systemic that extends well beyond one group, one sport, or one place. Now, over the years, we've worked with numerous organizations, and in sports, this includes both Alberta professional football teams, various minor football teams, staff at Hockey Alberta, and most recently, the Alberta Junior Hockey League, or the AJHL. So during the 21-22 season, we started with one team, the Blackfalds Bulldogs, and over 4 sessions, we explored what gender-based violence is, what consent means. We discussed healthy masculinities and healthy relationships and talked about their leadership role in making change. And after a transformative season, the Bulldogs put us in touch with Ryan Bartoshik, the commissioner of the AJ, so we could take this work across the league. Commissioner Bartoshik has been incredibly supportive and had this to say about the work, may it please the committee, and I quote, "We believe that our players can use their position as role models and leaders in Alberta communities to contribute to positive change and promote anti-violence. The Alberta Council of Women's Shelters has provided our young athletes with education on abuse prevention, consent, and assistance in identifying how they can model this leadership in their everyday lives. We thank the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters for their commitment to this initiative and look forward to the partnership in the upcoming 23-24 season." End quote. So this past year, we worked with about 400 players in the league. We talked in depth about issues ranging from the unhealthy messaging that's circulating on some internet forums, to navigating news media on current events related to gender-based violence, to understanding the amount of safety work that most women do just to leave their house on a daily basis, to how to hear a no and respond respectfully to that. The players were all left with the same message, that it is not enough to not be part of the problem. They need to be part of the solution actively. And the feedback we got from this was very encouraging. Since completing the season, as I mentioned, Commissioner Bartoshik has invited us back for next year. We've been recognized by the Edmonton chapter of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund for our work, and we've presented our work at a national conference, leading to conversations about how to expand the program. So may it please the committee, it's important when looking at solutions to these challenges to consider the resources required to run programs like ours. We firmly believe that supporting women's organizations to do this work both maintains accountability back to the people who have lived experience of violence, but it also ensures that the response evolves quickly, because violence itself evolves and manifests through changing technology and in responses to factors like COVID-19. We really need to be able to rise to meet this challenge that's ongoing in real time. This past year, we were fortunate to receive funding from the Canadian Women's Foundation and the Edmonton Kinsman Club for different aspects of our work.
30 seconds.
That said, these are one-time grants which require significant work to source and secure. Our organization respectfully requests that in its recommendations, the committee consider 2 items. First, that women's organizations be supported to do this work and that any program that might be implemented have accountability back to women's organizations. And second, that stable and multi-year funding be considered as an essential part of any proposal the committee puts forth. Merci bien. Mr. Parker and I both welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chulabia. And now we go to the question period time, and I'm going to have to juggle this time a little bit. I'm going to make a suggestion to the committee and let me know if there is any disagreement with it. I'm thinking we could, for the 6-minute round, we could make it a 5-minute round. Then we will have a second round where we can do 3 minutes for the two rounds for the Conservatives and the Liberals, and 2 minutes for the NDP and the Bloc. That'll give us the ability to go a little bit over time without going too much over time. All right.
Yes, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I'm sorry. I would ask you to stick to the 6-minute rotation, please.
All right, and we may not be able to have a full second round, okay? Because we have to think about resources and getting out of the room. All right, we will stick to the 6-minute round. Is everybody in agreement with Peter on that? No. Okay, fine. So 6 minutes. I begin the first round. The round is 6 minutes. The 6 minutes include the question and answer. So please, everyone, try to be succinct if we can get in everything in time. And so the first question would come from the Conservatives. I have no name from the Conservatives about who would speak.
I'm speaking.
Yes, Martin, go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the witnesses being here today. You were here previously, and most of your testimony was to do with different subject matter, but you did initiate at the end this conversation, which I very much appreciated. Thank you in the sense for what your work has been doing. We've heard many challenges, but this is something more positive in what can be done. So I know the commissioner, and if we do get time in this study, he's willing to appear here. Alberta Junior Hockey League is in playoffs at the moment, which includes the town I'm in, of course. But your messaging in the sense, as I talk to the commissioner who has participated, from my understanding, in sessions with you, his evaluation of what you were doing and what you're attempting to do with the players under their league, the 16-year-old to 21-year-old young men, he felt incredibly valuable. You've quoted him. I would look for more responses that you may have had from other sources, other people. What other feedback are you getting for what you are out to accomplish?
So we have had a great response. Leading change, we like to call it a promising practice that has over 10 years worth of evidence-based research behind it. So we've been doing this work for a very long time, and all of our evaluations are really quite positive. So I can tell you stories about players. We go and we meet them in their locker rooms. So we often speak to them about, how is this for you? How are you doing? Because they just want to chat afterwards. And one player in particular I can think of who is aging out of the league this year said, 5 years ago when I started, this conversation would never have happened in the AJHL. And now it just seems normal, and it's making us a better team. It's making us stronger players. We're able to talk about things that are more difficult than we were previously. And if it pleases Madam Chair, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Anthony, who went through the training as a Stampeder about 10 years ago, close to, and has had experience as a facilitator as well.
Certainly.
You go there.
Mr. Parker?
Just before you go there, I appreciated you identifying where you held these sessions. You held them in their locker rooms, in their environment. You came to them where they worked.
Absolutely.
Right. That's an important piece to this for those players, how that made a difference from what I've heard. Thanks. Mr. Parker.
Thank you. Yes, I can definitely relate to having taken part in this training and then, of course, proceeding to becoming a facilitator. I think that the point that you just brought up about bringing it to the players in their locker rooms has proven to be tremendously valuable. Coming from that environment, I understand what it's like to be in that, hyper masculinized environment where we're expected to adhere to some certain norm or whatever that may be. And so being in their environment in the locker room, that's their comfort zone. And so we're able to go in there and really just have positive, face-to-face conversations in an environment where, their guards are going to be a little bit more down and they're a little bit more receptive. I can also attest to the fact that I remember having that mentality of when I started this program, that this was not going to be something that could be done in the locker room, with my guys. It was like I could see myself having this conversation outside of the locker room. And I can come to say now that I was pleasantly surprised in the response that I got. I'd like to also mention, as far as further examples, the impact that this program can have. I remember having a conversation with the Calgary Canucks in their locker room just a couple months ago. Wonderful conversation, great group of guys, and they were very receptive, and they were, thankful to us for coming to have that conversation, being willing to, coming from somebody who had been in their position. They found tremendous value in that, and I was wonderfully impressed when the next day at my kids' school, I happened to see, 4 of the Calgary Canucks there taking part in, a reading program with K to 6 kids. And just goes to show when you're having that positive impact on those players, how that multiplicity can affect everything, right? They're going to have now the opportunity to have positive impact on all of the people in their communities. So I just like to share that with the committee, just what a wonderful impact that has had. And I've been able to witness that firsthand.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Martin?
Right. Back to in the sense that this is not an easy and cheap process. It takes resources and it takes authentic voices. The request, in a sense, for multi-year is critical. This 1 year off, I think, is short-sighted. How has this response been in the sense of this request being out there for who needs to be authentic voices as participants to do this, because this is not an easy thing to do, and the multi-year funding for it? What has been your response to this message?
We've not yet been able to secure multi-year funding. So we're currently in that position of trying to source funding.
Excuse me, please. Someone has their mic on in the room. Can you please turn it off? Thank you. Now, Ms. Schillebeer, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So yes, as I mentioned, we haven't as of yet been successful in securing multi-year funding to support the program. I would advise, though it is expensive to us as a charity organization, from a government budget perspective, it is relatively inexpensive. I don't know that there's a women's organization out there that hasn't yet figured out how to turn a dime into a dollar. In terms of the authentic voices bringing this work forward, it's really important that this be informed by the lived experiences of people who have experienced violence. And being an organization that is a member-based organization representing women's shelters in the province, we have been able to bring that forward and represent those voices. So when I mentioned that we had been presenting at a national conference on this work recently, it was a women's shelters conference, and we do have interest from a number of other organizations across the country to be able to take this prevention work forward. However, again, funding becomes that challenging issue of trying to make sure that we are able to travel to meet all those teams. In Alberta, we went from Fort McMurray to Brooks and east to west, Grand Prairie to Lloydminster. So we were in all corners of Alberta, and that does take time, staff resources, and there are travel costs involved.
For doing it for
Thank
1
you.
year, I'm out of time, Madam Chair?
No, you have 30 seconds.
Right.
30
Could you give
seconds,
an
Malcolm?
estimate of the amount of resources and time that it took to run this program for 1 year in one province with one group of people?
I would estimate in terms of time, that was a huge commitment because we were doing everything during the season. So we were very focused on this and primarily this for about 4 months. And that was a team of two of us, 2.5 staff of ACWS, as well as some of our community facilitators, such as Mr. Parker. In terms of costs, we have actually costed out looking at the next year of implementing our year 2 curriculum, and we're looking at about, between $40,000 and $50,000.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that's it, and we're going to move on to the next question, and that would be from the Liberals. Chris Biffle for the Liberals. Chris, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. I guess I'll direct my questions at Dr. Macfarlane. I agree with you. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be discussing many of these issues if the NDAs stood. But I guess I come at it as a former practitioner in civil litigation where the use of NDAs, use of confidentiality clauses in settlement agreements were pretty standard, whether even if it was a small claims court dispute on something relatively minor, or with a firm precedent always put that, always had a confidentiality clause in there. Is what you're proposing eliminating NDAs with respect to violence, harassment, or should it be across the board with respect to settlements?
Yeah, that's a great question. The legislation that we are advocating for is limited to non-disclosure agreements that cover up misconduct, sexual misconduct, harassment, bullying, and discrimination. And can I just add that there are an astonishing number of cases of proven discrimination, and I'm talking now pregnancy discrimination, discrimination against people with disabilities where they're not being accommodated and being forced out, and also many, many, many cases of discrimination on the basis of race and anti-Indigenous racism. So we are seeing an enormous proliferation of the use of non-disclosure agreements in these cases, and much as you indicated, they have become the default. We have data now that shows that a significant number of people, for example, in the United States, there are 3 studies that now show that 1 in 3 people is subject to a non-disclosure agreement. And there is data that we have put together from the quantitative survey we've been running that show that a third of the people who answered that survey have also been asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And let me just pause a moment and and suggest that there is an important distinction here between a confidentiality agreement that simply says the amount of the settlement will not be divulged. That is, I know, standard practice, and in fact, there's an exception in the legislation for just that. There may also be perhaps the need for confidentiality that the parties both agree to in terms of not speaking to the media or making this public. But what non-disclosure agreements are doing now is they are preventing people from speaking up for their entire lives, because these are indefinite agreements. They are until the end of one's life. In fact, I've heard arguments that they endure even after the death of the predator. But these are agreements for the lifetime of the victims who sign them, that they cannot speak to anybody. And we're talking about family, friends, therapists, counselors, elders, people who might support them. This is why it was apparently impossible for Soccer Canada to put a red flag on Mr. Barada, because he would have negotiated a non-disclosure agreement that would have kept everything that he did secret. And everybody would be too afraid to break that and to make it known that he is somebody who should be treated as a possibly dangerous person to be coaching young people. So we are, yes, confining this to those cases: misconduct, sexual violence and abuse, harassment and discrimination. But I would also say that the committee should be aware that these NDAs are also being used in consumer disputes. The reason that we didn't know about tainted baby formula for almost 20 years after the first settlement was made, and that formula kept on being sold and poisoning babies, was because of an NDA. We see them as well in professional services disagreements, where there is apparently, an oath taken to never speak of this again. And we see them in complaints in care homes, where people who speak up about concerns about the care being given to their relatives, or even professionals in the care homes, are being immediately NDA'd. So I think that is extremely dangerous, and I don't understand why there is any reason to perpetuate something that has, to a great extent, caused the re-victimization of folks in sports and beyond.
Thank you so much. I agree with you. You mentioned, legislation in Ireland with respect to the whole country. I was wondering if you could speak to the jurisdictional issues in Canada, and who would have to pass such legislation at what level of government?
Well, as obviously you would know, as a lawyer, the employment law in Canada is almost entirely provincial. And so we have been moving province by province because it needs to be done on a provincial level. However, I would add, and I have permission to inform you today, that there is a whole group of people who, of course, are employed by the federal government. And there are also many organizations and agencies that are funded by the federal government, including Hockey Canada, of course. And there will be a bill tabled shortly in the federal government to protect those workers in the federal government from being NDA'd. And again, we have many, many examples of individuals working for this government who have raised complaints about discrimination, complaints about sexual harassment, and they have been NDA'd and terminated. And I think it's very important to protect that group as well. But the vast majority of our work, because that is the jurisdiction of employment law, is province by province.
30 seconds. Chris?
Thank you so much, Dr. Macfarlane. I just take the last few seconds to thank you for your work. It's very important work, and I kind of laughed to myself when you said you do know that, and of course I do, because I'm a University of Windsor grad, so I had excellent professors at the time. So I want to thank you for all your work that you're doing and the important work that you're moving forward with. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I now move to the Bloc Québécois. Sébastien Lemire. Sébastien, for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dr. Macfarlane, thank you very much for your work, which we congratulate you on. Thank you for this cause that is very important to our work today with regard to for example, the protection of the image of Hockey Canada. And when we started this study, you referred to abusive use of NDAs. So I think that your presentation was very pertinent. And do you agree that there should be a public inquiry, independent public inquiry, to shed light on the situation of the abusive use of these NDAs in all sports, not just Hockey Canada and soccer, but all sports? And if you've been following what we have been discussing in this committee and elsewhere.
Yes, absolutely. I think that, there is a methodological problem here, as I would say, as a researcher, which is that we're talking about secret settlements. So how you collect data on secret settlements, of course, is very problematic. We've done it by allowing people to be anonymous in both telling their full stories and also completing our survey. And there has been quite a lot of material uncovered by various freedom of information requests over the last couple of years by journalists. But I think it will be imperative in an inquiry that includes looking at the use and the prevalence, which I think will shock even the members of the committee, of NDAs in sports organizations and beyond. It will be important, for example, to say that NDAs that were signed that would ordinarily prevent people even saying they signed an NDA, because of course you will realize that even saying you signed an NDA is a breach of an NDA. It will be very important to release people for that purpose, because otherwise there will be inevitably fear about people coming forward. The committee may know that in Manitoba, we have already had the bill there moved to committee. It's actually just starting all over again now, and it's about to go to committee again because there was not sufficient time for it to complete last session. In that committee, we made it clear to people who are in touch with us constantly about the use of NDAs and their silencing via an NDA, that they could speak without fear of consequences because they have parliamentary privilege to do so. And that session was absolutely amazing. It is available for people to watch on our YouTube channel. And I think that the inquiry needs to make clear that people can come forward and speak to them about being bound by an NDA with no consequences to them, because people literally live in fear. They live in fear of having the money that they may have been given to compensate for the harm taken away. And they also live in fear that their name will then be made public. They don't want their names made public. They want to maintain their own privacy and to control that as they would wish to do, which is exactly, for example, what the federal government's now doing in relation to criminal publication bans. Give the victims the right to control how public they want to be. So I hope that the inquiry will look at the use of NDAs, but it will have to be with some kind of amnesty or release for people who've signed them.
Madame Macfarlane, vous avez visiblement...
You've already answered a number of my questions, and I'd like to add, if I think about Ms. De Silva's testimony this week, and others did as well, talking about the prosecution there could be and how few resources there are for assisting athletes that might find themselves in this kind of situation. And how can we help people that dare to speak up, and would an inquiry help?
I think an inquiry will help. But I also, I'm sorry to be repetitive, have to return to the fact that what will really help is taking away the current right to force an NDA on somebody in order for them to secure their own privacy. One of the questions that's asked in our survey is for people who decided not to file a formal complaint of discrimination or harassment or sexual harassment. Why did they not do that? And over 30% now, the survey is increasing all the time. It's currently at about 1,200 people, which is a pretty respectable number. 1/3 of the people who said they didn't complain because they anticipated they would have to sign an NDA. And they didn't want to sign an NDA because increasingly Canadians understand just what that means. It means that you are silenced for the rest of your life And obviously, these folks aren't being followed around with video cameras, Sebastian, but people become very, very fearful. There are all kinds of mental health consequences that flow from this as well, that we also have a lot of data on. So I think that it will be critical to simply take away the possibility of an NDA in the future, which is what our legislation is doing, and to restrict that to the use of intellectual property and trade secrets, which was what this was originally designed to do in the 1980s.
30 seconds.
When NDAs were first developed, they were developed in Silicon Valley in the tech boom. And I think most people here will realize that there were good reasons to try to get beyond the existing restraint of trade common law and enable them to keep their commercial innovation information secret forever. That's what NDAs were for. And now we say that any kind of misconduct is a trade secret. That stretches the point.
Thank you, Dr. Macfarlane. I think your time is up, Sebastien. Thank you. And now I go to the New Democrats, Peter Julian. Peter, 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses who have greatly contributed to our consideration of this issue. The federal government has just reestablished funding for Hockey Canada, even if Hockey Canada hasn't changed its attitude with the use of NDAs. And I think this restoration of funding is a bit premature. And is this a healthy move on the part of the government to say, well, you haven't to change your attitude towards NDAs, but you're going to get your public funding back?
Receiving funding from the federal government after a suspension, even though they have not backed off from signing non-disclosure agreements. And this is something that has come up repeatedly in the Hockey Canada hearings we have had. So my question is very simple. Is it appropriate for the federal government to be financing Hockey Canada when they have not made any sort of commitment to stop the pressure of signing non-disclosure agreements for victims of sexual abuse or sexual violence?
May I answer?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
That's addressed to you.
Thank you, Dr.
Macfarlane.
You're directing it to Dr. Macfarlane. Go ahead, Dr. Macfarlane.
Thank you very much. I was absolutely shocked when I heard, I was away actually in the United Kingdom when the news came through a few weeks ago that Hockey Canada was going to get funding back, but without having said anything about NDAs. There was, in fact, a kind of throwaway comment that was made by the Hockey Canada CEO to the committee last summer when the hearings began, that if anybody wanted to be released from their NDA, no problem, just get in touch. I cannot tell you what a disingenuous statement that is, because how are people supposed to get in touch? They're supposed to Google Hockey Canada. Who do they ask? How do they do this? And of course, these are all people who are very fearful of the consequences of breaking their NDA. So I think that the very first thing that Hockey Canada should have done, and they should have done this last summer, was to say, we shall formally release people from existing non-disclosure agreements so that they can contribute to the work of the study and the work of the committee. And they should have done that, and they still can do it, by writing directly to each of the people. They know who the people are. They can write to them directly and say, here, we forthwith will take away, we will tear up your non-disclosure agreement. The second thing they should do, otherwise nothing, frankly, is going to change. It will all just be pushed back under the carpet again, is to undertake that they will not use them again in the future. They can make agreements for confidentiality on the amount of money they paid. There might be special circumstances that they want to agree to in terms of the public use of some of that information, but gagging victims without them being able to speak to anybody, and also, of course, being unable to then warn others about the people whom they have experienced. This has become so incredibly effective to enable these perpetrators to reoffend. And we see that over and over again. There is much research now, and I'm sure my colleague witnesses are very aware of this. There is much research that shows that the acts of violence and sexual violence and harassment are carried out by a very small number of people over and over and over again. This is very rarely a one-off occurrence. So we already know that people who have done this once are very likely to do it again, yet we're going to cover that up so they can do it again. So I believe Hockey Canada should both release people immediately by writing to them, not saying, hey, get in touch, we'll think about it. Write to them and release them. And secondly, they should undertake they should have been asked before funding was restored to undertake to never again use a non-disclosure agreement. But I did say as well at the beginning that I am also, I think that voluntary pledges are a very important part of culture change in relation to NDAs. But I think the reality is secret settlements have to be outlawed because we cannot monitor what is going on behind those closed doors.
Thank you, Dr. Macfarlane. And I should
just
say that Hockey Canada actually did pledge to release the victims from the non-disclosure agreements, and they have not followed up. In fact, they have doubled down, suggesting that victims somehow all want to sign these gag orders, which, of course, as you have disclosed, is disingenuous at best. We saw, you may have heard the testimony from Canada Soccer and the appalling, horrific case of Bob Berarda, where simply Canada Soccer neglected its obligations to the victims and allowed this sexual offender access to more victims. I am wondering, internationally, you've cited some countries that have non-disclosure legislation. In those countries, do the national sports organizations abide by those laws as well? Are you aware of a textbook case of a country that has obliged its national sports organizations to stop the practice of gagging the victims of sexual abuse and sexual violence through non-disclosure agreements?
Well, there are... just looking at the United States as an example, there are now 17 states that have passed legislation to restrict the use of non-disclosure agreements in cases of sexual violence, misconduct, discrimination, and so forth. We have all this information on our website. You can look at our tracker.
Thank you, Dr. Macfarlane. I am sorry, Peter, but we are now 40 seconds over your 6-minute mark. Now, we can go an extra 15 minutes, and I would like to get the committee's sense on this. Can you stay another 16 minutes? Because we do have we're at 5:30 when this meeting is officially supposed to end. We could go another 15 minutes. It would mean that we would do a round of 3 and 3 and 1.5, 1.5, and 3 and 3. You know what I'm talking about. Do I have an agreement for that?
Chair, actually, I think there was an agreement amongst the committee members because some people have flights to get to on Thursday night. We agreed that we would end at 5:30, and although I found the witnesses fascinating and would love to have links to all of the bills that have been put forward provincially and the draft federally, I think we have to cut it here.
All right, Ms. Gladue. Now, anyone disagreeing with Ms. Gladue? I cannot. I can see the floor. I don't see any hands being raised. So it's obvious that everyone is in agreement. So I think I want to thank the witnesses. It's as Marilyn said, it's fascinating. The issue of non-disclosure is a fascinating one. And I think that it's, the balance, as we've always heard, if you don't do a non-disclosure, people won't want to come up and victims won't want to come up and speak about their problems because they would be afraid. So there is there's two sides of the story, but what you are saying makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to thank you, all three of you, for coming and presenting. Thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for some very interesting testimony. And I now declare the meeting adjourned.